An old king writhes in the gloom of his castle. He speaks nonsense for hours, claims to converse with angels, and even salutes a sturdy oak tree as if it were a foreign monarch. He is confined in a straitjacket in his own royal quarters, while desperate physicians resort to bloodletting and useless brews in search of a cure. This is George III, King of Great Britain and Ireland, who after nearly 6 decades on the throne, dies blind, deaf, and consumed by madness. He was the longest reigning sovereign of England until then, a monarch whose life encompassed both triumphs and tragedies in equal measure. Under his rule, the British Empire experienced epic wars and revolutionary changes, from the loss of the American 13 colonies to the defeat of Napoleon, including the rise of the Industrial Revolution. But behind the pomp and power, George III fought his own internal battles, bitter family conflicts, a steadfast struggle for his principles, and above all, the devastating mental illness that would define his fate. In this video, we explore the life of George III, from his birth in the House of Hanover to his final days of delirium in Windsor. We will discover how a virtuous young prince became a revered king and later a tragic figure. This is the story of George III, a king devoted to his nation and his family, whose fall into madness revealed the fragile human condition, even at the height of power. Before we begin, we invite you to subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell so you don't miss any of our videos. Without further ado, let's begin. Birth and early years of life. George William Frederick of Hanover was born prematurely on 4th June 1738 in London, grandson of the then reigning George II. He was the first monarch of his dynasty to be born and educated on British soil, proud of his homeland, above his German origins. From childhood, George showed a shy and thoughtful character. His father, Frederick, Prince of Wales, died in 1751 when the boy was 12 years old, an event that made young George the heir presumptive to his grandfather, the king. From then on, his upbringing was strictly overseen by his mother, Princess Augusta of Saxe-Gotha, and by tutors appointed to shape him into an exemplary future king. Prince George received a refined and broad education, uncommon even among royalty of the time. He studied chemistry, physics, Latin, economics, music, and other subjects diligently, becoming considered one of the best educated monarchs of his era. He spoke fluent English, without the strong German accent of his Hanoverian predecessors, as well as French and some German. His tutors encouraged intellectual curiosity. The young prince devoured books on philosophy, law, and history, taking notes from works by David Hume, Montesquieu, and Blackstone with fascination. He also cultivated the arts. He played the clavichord, piano, and flute, performing works by his beloved George Friedrich Handel on an old clavichord that had once belonged to the composer. This solid education instilled in George a deep sense of duty, sincere religious faith, and a moral vision of monarchy that would guide his decisions. Not everything, however, was extraordinary virtue. Some contemporaries saw him as a young man of moderate talent but strong will. In the words of historian Wilhelm Troy, George III showed from childhood a mediocre intellectual capacity, although his willpower surpassed his mental faculties. He had a strong fear of God instilled by his family and was known from a young age for his upright behavior. Far from the dissipated lifestyle of many aristocrats, the prince avoided scandal. He loved his entire family, especially his mother and siblings, with the sole exception of his eldest son, something that would only become evident years later, whom he would come to see more as a rival than as an heir. But that dark family tension still lay ahead. In his early years, young George grew up as a model prince, pious, studious, and conscious of the burden that would one day rest on his shoulders. Accession to the throne and royal marriage. On 25 October 1760, at just 22 years of age, George ascended the throne upon the death of his grandfather, George II. Thus, he became George III, King of Great Britain and Ireland. In his inaugural speech to Parliament, the young sovereign distanced himself from his foreign-born predecessors. He proudly declared his British identity and his determination to govern with virtue. One of his first priorities as the new king was to secure the succession and bring stability to the dynasty through a proper marriage. After a careful search, the bride had to be of royal blood, Protestant, and of gentle character. Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, a 17-year-old princess from a small German court, was chosen. George had never seen her but trusted in the judgment of his advisors and in his own sense of duty. The royal wedding took place almost immediately. Charlotte arrived in England on 8th September 1761, and just 6 hours after meeting, the king and the young princess were married in the royal chapel. To the surprise of many, that arranged union turned into a warm and harmonious marriage. George III and Queen Charlotte were remarkably well suited from the very beginning. Both shared a deep passion for music. Charlotte had a refined musical taste and had even discovered and sponsored the young Mozart as a child, and both shared a simple love of country life. The king took a keen interest in experimental agriculture, earning the affectionate nickname Farmer George for his devotion to the royal farms, while the queen enjoyed botany and gardening. They also shared a desire for a family life removed from excessive protocol, preferring to spend their days at quiet residences outside London, such as Kew Palace, leading a relatively private domestic existence. Over the years, George came to love Charlotte deeply. Unlike his predecessors, he never took a mistress nor caused scandal at court with infidelities. On the contrary, he was a devoted and exemplary husband. The royal couple slept in the same bed every night, a rare practice among monarchs of the time, until George's mental illness forced their separation in his final years. From this marriage were born no fewer than 15 children, 9 sons and 6 daughters, 13 of whom survived into adulthood. During their childhood, George III was a loving and attentive father who enjoyed organizing games and musical evenings for his large family. A contemporary observer noted that the king, despite his formal manner, could show great consideration towards them. In a letter written after decades of marriage, Charlotte revealed the deep affection that bound them together. "At this moment, I have been made very happy by your affectionate and kind letter, for which I have no words to express my joy and happiness," wrote the Queen to George in 1797. "I can truly say that although my pen cannot express my feelings, my heart feels them deeply." This declaration, made 30 years after their wedding, confirms that their relationship was based on mutual loyalty and tenderness. However, not everything would be bliss in the king's family life. As time went on, tensions would arise, especially with his eldest son and heir, the Prince of Wales. But before delving into those conflicts, let us examine how the reign of George III unfolded in its early stages. The early years of the reign. At the beginning of his reign, George III aimed to be a model monarch of morality and public service, setting himself apart from the somewhat dissolute reputation of his predecessors. His subjects soon noticed and applauded the young king's marital fidelity and his simple, frugal lifestyle, domestic virtues unheard of on the Hanoverian throne. He quickly won the affection of the British people, who approved of the fact that George III truly cared for the livelihood of the common man and promoted the arts and sciences as a matter of state. In fact, in 1768, he founded the Royal Academy of Arts to foster the fine arts in the kingdom, sponsored scientific and geographic expeditions, such as Captain James Cook's voyages across the Pacific, and generously supported thinkers and inventors. Under his patronage, eminent figures such as Samuel Johnson, David Hume, and the astronomer William Herschel received pensions or funding to continue their work. However, not everything was political harmony in those early years. George III, determined to exercise his prerogatives actively, sometimes clashed with the powerful parliamentary aristocracy. The Whigs, the dominant party for decades, were suspicious of the king's intentions to influence government beyond ceremonial roles. His prime ministers changed frequently during the 1760s due to court intrigues and disagreements. Even so, George persevered in consolidating his concept of a patriotic and reformist monarchy. He wished to reign according to the principles of the Glorious Revolution of 1688, which had established a balance between monarch and parliament, but without being a mere figurehead. "The pride and glory of Great Britain is political liberty," he had written in a youthful essay, showing a clear understanding of the checks and balances between the king, the commons, and the lords. Thus, George III aspired to govern within the constitution, but with moral leadership, guiding his ministers firmly when necessary. On the international stage, the kingdom was still embroiled in the 7 Years' War at the time of George's accession. This global conflict against France and its allies would end shortly thereafter with a British victory, leaving England with vast colonial territories in America and Asia. But the war had been costly. To manage the new empire and ease the finances, the government attempted to make the American colonies contribute more to the royal coffers through taxation. Few imagined that these fiscal measures would plant the seed of an unprecedented crisis, the rupture between the Crown and the 13 colonies of North America. From the early 1770s, tension in America increased. The colonists rejected the tax laws imposed from London, viewing them as unjust since they lacked parliamentary representation. There were notable protests, such as the Boston Tea Party in 1773, when a group of colonists threw a shipment of British tea into the sea in defiance. The government of George III responded harshly to this challenge. Prime Minister Lord North pushed through the so-called Intolerable Acts, which punished Massachusetts by closing the port of Boston and curtailing local freedoms. The king supported these actions, convinced that royal authority had to be respected. However, events were already in motion. In April 1775, the first armed skirmishes broke out between British troops and colonial militias in Lexington and Concord. The American Revolution had begun. In the following months, George III received a petition sent from the Continental Congress in Philadelphia, in which the colonists professed loyalty to the king, but requested the reversal of the oppressive measures. When that plea reached London, the monarch had already received news of the gunfire in the colonies. War was a fait accompli. On 4 July 1776, the representatives of the 13 colonies signed the Declaration of Independence of the United States. That bold document, written primarily by Thomas Jefferson, accused George III directly of tyranny. He has abdicated government here. He has plundered our seas, ravaged our coasts, burnt our towns, and destroyed the lives of our people, proclaimed the declaration, listing the king's alleged offenses. Upon hearing these harsh words, George III flew into a rage. To him, the rebel leaders were insolent traitors. Determined not to yield, the king stubbornly supported all military efforts to crush the insurrection in America. At first, the balance seemed to tilt in Britain's favor. The powerful regular army achieved some victories in 1776 and 77. But after the unexpected defeat at Saratoga, everything changed. France seized the opportunity to ally with the American rebels in 1778, followed by Spain in 1779, internationalizing the conflict. The war became increasingly complicated and costly for Britain. Finally, the news of General Cornwallis's surrender at Yorktown struck like a hammer blow in London. That decisive defeat made it clear that the war was lost. With sorrow and frustration, George III acknowledged the defeat in North America and authorized his government to begin peace negotiations. Lord North, disheartened, resigned in 1782 after 12 years in office. In 1783, through the Treaty of Paris, Britain recognized the independence of the United States, marking the end of the First British Empire in North America. This was undoubtedly the most humiliating moment of George III's reign. The king, proud and patriotic, had lost the colonies that had once been the jewel of the empire. In a gesture of dignity, in 1785, he received the first ambassador from the newly born American Republic, John Adams. Against all odds, the meeting was courteous. The defeated monarch, proudly and kindly, showed Adams his royal library, demonstrating that he bore no personal grudge towards Americans as individuals. Political crisis and first signs of madness. Despite the loss of the colonies, George III managed to maintain internal stability in his kingdom after 1783, thanks to skillful political maneuvering. Deeply displeased with the Whig ministers who had forced him to accept peace, especially the radical Charles James Fox, the king seized an opportunity to rid himself of them. At the end of 1783, when the Fox-North coalition pushed forward a controversial East India Bill that threatened to reduce royal influence in colonial administration, George III reacted with unusual severity. "I shall consider anyone who votes in favor of this bill my personal enemy," he warned the Lords. His message had an effect. The bill was rejected and the government collapsed. Immediately, the king appointed a young and capable ally as Prime Minister, William Pitt, the younger, barely 24 years old. Pitt's rise in 1784 marked the beginning of a long period of conservative government and cooperation between the king and his minister. George III strongly supported Pitt, and in turn, Pitt respected the monarch's authority and counsel. The new government comfortably won the 1784 elections, consolidating royal power and restoring George's popularity among his subjects. These were years of relative prosperity, with advances in the Industrial Revolution, expansion of trade, and post-war stability. But in private, the first symptoms of something abnormal had already emerged. George III had enjoyed good mental health in the early decades of his reign, apart from a brief episode in 1765 that some remembered as a strange indisposition, accompanied by agitation and momentary confusion. At the age of 27, after suffering a prolonged fever with chest infections, the young king seemed to experience a kind of nervous breakdown. He complained of severe insomnia, confessing that he slept no more than 2 hours a night and appeared indecisive, overwhelmed in making government decisions. Although that 1765 crisis soon passed, it may have been the early warning of the illness that would later afflict him. For more than 2 decades, there were no significant relapses. However, in the summer of 1788, George began to feel ill once more. At the age of 50, the king began to suffer from intense abdominal pain, fatigue, and insomnia, accompanied by episodes of fever and a curious yellowish discoloration in his eyes and skin. The royal physicians could find no clear explanation. In October 1788, the king's health collapsed dramatically. He suffered what we would now describe as an acute psychotic episode. His behavior became erratic and alarming. He began to speak non-stop, incoherently and obsessively, for hours and hours. The king rambled on about all sorts of subjects. His verbosity was such that those around him could barely understand him. The entire court was shaken. Never had His Majesty been seen in such a condition. Soon, rumors spread among the people that the king had gone mad, or even that he had died, for he had not been seen in public for months. The truth was that George III had fallen into a deep mental crisis. The royal doctors, baffled, considered explanations ranging from cerebral fevers to sorcery. No one could definitively diagnose the cause. By late 1788, the verdict was inescapable. The king's illness was not temporary. One of the most renowned physicians attending him, Dr. Richard Warren, gave a blunt report. "Our king is mad," he declared. Faced with this terrifying prospect, the royal family was overwhelmed with anguish. Queen Charlotte and her daughters, accustomed to the king's kind demeanor, could barely see him. For safety, they were kept away from George during the most acute phases of his madness. Charlotte, in despair, was consumed by anxiety, but strove to maintain composure and fulfill her duties. The doctors recommended drastic measures. The king had to be confined and subjected to treatment. At the beginning of November 1788, George was discreetly transferred to Kew Palace, away from the public eye. There, a famous physician specializing in mental illness, Dr. Francis Willis, took charge of his care. Willis, a clergyman turned doctor, applied methods both innovative and brutal. He imposed strict discipline, long walks, cold baths, and firm behavioral control, but also used force when necessary. The king was strapped with leather restraints to a specially built chair designed to immobilize him, which George, with macabre humor, called "my coronation chair," and was frequently secured in a straitjacket to prevent him from harming himself or attacking others. Likewise, the doctors regularly bled him and administered purgatives, such as the so-called James's powder, made from mercury and antimony, in an attempt to balance his supposed humors. These were painful treatments that today seem horrifying, but in the 18th century, understanding of mental illness was extremely primitive. Meanwhile, the kingdom faced an unprecedented constitutional dilemma. With the sovereign incapacitated from exercising his duties, George III was not even able to open the new session of Parliament in November 1788, as was customary. Who would govern the country? The proposal to appoint a regent to assume royal powers during the king's madness arose immediately. Everyone agreed that the natural candidate was the Prince of Wales, George, the king's eldest son, aged 26. However, a bitter political dispute erupted in Westminster. The leader of the Whig opposition, Charles James Fox, declared that the prince had an absolute right to govern in his ailing father's name. Prime Minister Pitt, by contrast, argued that it was Parliament's prerogative to appoint the regent and define his powers, fearing, with reason, that the Prince of Wales, future George IV, would use the regency to remove him and reverse the king's policies. The heir apparent was indeed known for his dissolute lifestyle and friendships opposed to Pitt. Father and son had been estranged for years. Prince George was extravagant, wasteful with gambling and drink, and had secretly married a Catholic, Mary Fitzherbert, in violation of dynastic laws. These scandals had outraged the king, sparking one of the bitterest family quarrels in the dynasty's history. Now, the possible regency of the rebellious son threatened to completely alter the course of the nation. During the winter of 1788 to 1789, Great Britain teetered on the edge of an institutional crisis. The public followed the news of the mad king's health with unease, while politicians debated heatedly in London. Finally, in February 1789, Parliament passed a regency bill authorizing the Prince of Wales to act as regent. Recovery and years of stability. In March 1789, after almost half a year of mental darkness, George III began to show remarkable signs of improvement. Against the odds, the king gradually regained his sanity under Dr. Willis's care. His episodes ceased, his speech became coherent again, and his spirits stabilized. The doctors removed the restraints and joyfully announced that His Majesty had overcome the crisis. The news spread like wildfire. The king had recovered. The entire nation erupted in celebration. George III, with humility and religious fervor, ordered a special service of thanksgiving at St. Paul's Cathedral to publicly give thanks for his divine restoration. Far from ruining the king's reputation, the episode of madness ended up humanizing him and earning him even greater popular sympathy. Now reinstated on the throne, George III gratefully acknowledged the support of his wife Charlotte during the crisis. The Queen had remained steadfast by his side, and though protocol had kept her physically distant during the worst moments, her devotion had never wavered. The years that followed brought new challenges, but George III faced them with renewed energy. In 1789, the French Revolution broke out, shocking all European monarchies. George, horrified by the fate of King Louis XVI, who was guillotined, aligned himself firmly against the revolutionary tide. Great Britain went to war with Republican France in 1793, beginning the so-called Napoleonic Wars, which would last more than 2 decades. Under his reign, Great Britain was a key member of successive coalitions against Napoleon. There were critical moments. The first coalition was defeated in 1798 and the second in 1800. Despite everything, the country persevered almost alone against the Napoleonic Empire. George III, now in his 60s, represented continuity and resolve. His mere presence on the throne gave the people confidence in such tumultuous times. On the domestic front, the royal family continued to be a complex matter. George and Charlotte's children grew up, and many of them caused disappointment. Ironically, the virtuous king saw several of his offspring become dissipated adults, accumulating debts and scandals. His heir, Prince George, future George IV, in particular, persisted in his life of excess, maintaining mistresses and squandering fortunes. Father and son barely spoke except during official events, and their relationship became poisoned over the years. Nevertheless, George III also had family joys. He enjoyed the company of his daughters, especially the youngest, Princess Amelia, whom he adored. Relapses into darkness. Madness returns. Despite his recovery in 1789, George III's mental peace hung by a thread. Doctors warned that periodic relapses could occur, and unfortunately, they did. In 1795, during a tense moment in the war, a slight deviation in the king's behavior was observed, though manageable. Later, in 1801, when Great Britain signed the short-lived Peace of Amiens with Napoleon, George suffered another significant crisis. That year coincided with political stress for him. His beloved Prime Minister Pitt had to resign when the king flatly refused to accept Catholic emancipation in Ireland after the Act of Union of 1800. George III, a devout Protestant, believed that granting rights to Catholics would violate his coronation oath. The very idea caused him such anxiety that his health deteriorated. In February 1801, he suffered another episode of mental disorder, though shorter than that of 1788. Pitt, seeing the monarch's obstinacy and his relapse, resigned, and George appointed the affable Henry Addington to succeed him as Prime Minister. The king managed to recover once again and resumed his duties, but by then his physical ailments had also accumulated. He suffered from joint rheumatism, and his vision began to cloud, believed to be due to cataracts. Even so, in 1809, George III proudly celebrated his Golden Jubilee, marking 50 years on the throne, something unprecedented for a British monarch at that time. The country celebrated him with banquets and patriotic songs in honor of the old king. But the joy would be short-lived. Personal tragedy lay just around the corner. In November 1810, the beloved Princess Amelia, the youngest of the royal family, died at the age of 27 after a long illness, probably tuberculosis worsened by porphyria. The death of his favorite daughter was a devastating blow from which George III never recovered. Upon hearing the news, the king fell into a deep depression that quickly gave way to a state of permanent madness. The symptoms reappeared with fury. He spoke incessantly, detached from reality, sometimes rambling that he conversed with invisible beings. On one occasion, he was seen solemnly greeting a large oak tree in the gardens, convinced it was King Friedrich Wilhelm III of Prussia. He also claimed to have conversed with angels who brought him celestial messages. These hallucinations showed that his mind had become definitively lost. At the age of 72, George III was entirely incapacitated to reign. In February 1811, Parliament acted once more and passed a second Regency Act, this time without opposition, appointing the Prince of Wales as regent to exercise power in his father's place. Following the same procedure as in 1789, the royal assent was validated extraordinarily due to the sovereign's dementia. From that year onward, Prince George would rule as Prince Regent, and in practice, King George III withdrew from public life forever. The final years of George III were sad and somber. He was confined to Windsor Castle, far from the bustle of London, under constant care. There, he lived in isolation, in a wing of the castle, adapted as though it were a sanatorium. His wife Charlotte would die in 1818 without ever having properly said farewell to George. He, so lost in his own world, was unable even to comprehend or react to the news of his queen's death. Meanwhile, outside, the kingdom carried on under the command of the regent. The Napoleonic Wars came to an end with the British victory at Waterloo in 1815, during the de facto rule of George IV. Paradoxically, although George III was no longer aware, his realm had reached the pinnacle of power in Europe with Napoleon's defeat. As the 1810s advanced, George III's physical health deteriorated entirely. He lost his sight completely, becoming blind, possibly due to untreated cataracts. He was also nearly deaf, which made it difficult for his caretakers even to soothe him with words. At Christmas in 1819, he suffered his final major episode. He raved without interruption for 58 hours straight, 2.5 days of unintelligible speech, until he collapsed into a deep coma. He never regained consciousness. Finally, on the night of 29th of January 1820, George III expired at the age of 81 at Windsor Castle, blind, deaf, and mad to the very end. He had reigned for 59 years and 96 days, a record in British history that would only be surpassed later by his granddaughter, Queen Victoria, and, much later still, by Queen Elizabeth II. The body of the unfortunate monarch was interred on 16th of February 1820 in St. George's Chapel, Windsor, officially marking the end of the era of George III. He was succeeded by the then regent, who was crowned King George IV, ushering in a new, less glorious chapter. For that son whom George III had always regarded with reproach would go on to earn the reputation of being one of the most unpopular kings in British history. Thank you for staying with us until the end of the video. We hope you enjoyed it. If you have anything to contribute, don't hesitate to share it with us in the comments section. Give us a like and share the link with all your friends and family so they can learn more about the life of King George III of England. Thank you for following us, and if you haven't subscribed yet, we invite you to do so and activate the notification bell, as we regularly upload historical content that will surely interest you. See you in the next video.